The morning cold bit deep at High Hollow Ranch as the sun crept over the Colorado plains, painting the weathered fence posts in shades of rust and shadow. Dust devils danced across the gray grassland, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain that would never reach this parched corner of the earth. Boone Mercer stood on the porch of his ranch house, the silvered wood groaning beneath his boots. His eyes, the color of winter sky, tracked the approaching wagon as it climbed the red dirt road. The woman driving it sat straight-backed despite the jolting ride, her bonnet pulled low against the wind. "You, Rebecca Wynne." His voice came out rough as gravel, unused to conversation beyond what was necessary with his ranch hands. "I am." She brought the wagon to a halt, wrapping the reins around the brake handle with practiced efficiency. "You advertised for a housekeeper?" He studied her for a long moment. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, with hands that showed the calluses of hard work. Her dress was clean but mended in several places, the fabric faded from countless washings. Something in her eyes, a steadiness, a refusal to look away, reminded him of the hawks that circled the mesa. "Work starts at dawn, ends when it's done. Sunday's your own if you want it. Room off the kitchen, meals included. $20 monthly." "That's fair." She climbed down from the wagon, movements careful but not delicate. "When do I start?" "Now, if you're willing." No handshake passed between them. No smile softened the transaction. They stood on opposite sides of an invisible line, two people who had learned that keeping distance was safer than reaching out. The house exhaled stillness as Rebecca stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the slanted light from windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, maybe years. The main room held a stone fireplace, cold now, with a layer of ash thick enough to write in. A rocking chair sat motionless by the hearth, its runners worn smooth. In the kitchen, cast iron pans hung from hooks, their surfaces dull with disuse. The table bore the scars of countless meals eaten alone, knife marks, coffee stains, the ghost of a burn where something hot had been set down without care. "I'll get my things," Rebecca said, breaking the silence that pressed against the walls like a living thing. Boone nodded, already turning away. "Copper might growl some. He's old, set in his ways." The dog in question lifted his graying muzzle from his paws, regarding the newcomer with clouded eyes. His tail gave one tentative thump against the floor, then stilled. By the time Rebecca had unloaded her few possessions, a carpet bag, a wooden crate of books, a quilt wrapped in oilcloth, the afternoon shadows were stretching long across the yard. She found Boone in the barn, checking the hooves of a bay mare. "Anything particular you want for supper?" she asked. He straightened slowly, as if the question required thought. "Whatever's easiest. There's salt pork in the larder, beans, cornmeal. Garden's mostly dead, but might be some potatoes left." "I'll see what I can do." That first evening, Rebecca moved through the kitchen like she was learning a new language. The stove was temperamental, the damper sticky, but her hands knew the rhythm of coaxing fire from cold metal. Soon the smell of coffee, strong and bitter, wound through the house. Biscuits rose in the oven, golden-topped and fragrant. She found him again on the porch, watching the sun sink behind Dry Creek Ridge. Without speaking, she handed him a plate beans flavored with the last onion from the garden, a thick slice of salt pork, 2 biscuits with a pat of butter she'd discovered in the spring house. "Obliged," he said, the word rusty. They ate in separate spaces, he on the porch, she at the kitchen table. The house stood between them like a mediator, translating their silence into something almost companionable. As darkness settled over High Hollow, Rebecca washed the dishes by lamplight. Through the window, she could see Boone's silhouette against the stars, still and solitary as a fence post. Inside, Copper had crept closer to the kitchen door, his ancient body seeking the warmth that followed this new presence. In her small room off the kitchen, Rebecca unpacked slowly, her mother's Bible, its pages soft with handling. A photograph of her parents, their faces stern but kind. A handful of her mother's recipes, written in fading ink. Each item she placed with care, creating a tiny island of familiarity in this sea of strangeness. She thought of her last position in Los Alamos, of Mrs. Hartley's sharp eyes and sharper tongue, of wages docked for a broken plate, of accusations that cut deeper than any slap. She thought of her mother coughing through that last hard winter, of neighbors who turned away when help was needed most, of the basket of apples that appeared on their doorstep, the only kindness in a season of cold. Through the thin walls, she heard Boone's footsteps, the scrape of his chair, the clink of his coffee cup against the saucer. These sounds were different from the careful quiet of the Hartley house, where every noise might bring criticism. This was the quiet of choice, of a man who had built walls not from cruelty, but from pain. Rebecca understood walls. She had her own, constructed carefully over years of disappointment and small betrayals. As she spread her mother's quilt over the narrow bed, she wondered if two people could share a space while keeping their walls intact, if silence could be a bridge as well as a barrier. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, its voice threading through the darkness. The wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. The house creaked and settled, adjusting to the presence of two souls instead of one. Boone sat by the cold fireplace, a book open but unread in his lap. The words swam before his eyes, meaningless as tracks in sand. His mind kept circling back to the kitchen, to the woman moving quietly through his space, changing it simply by being there. The coffee had been better than any he'd made in months. The biscuits had reminded him of... He closed the book sharply, cutting off the thought before it could fully form. Some memories were better left buried, like seeds that would grow poison if allowed to sprout. In the kitchen, Rebecca finished her preparations for morning wood split and stacked by the stove. Kindling arranged just so, the coffee pot scrubbed and ready. These rituals soothed her, gave shape to the formless anxiety that always accompanied a new position. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she had done what she could. As she turned down her lamp, she caught sight of Boone through the doorway, his profile etched by moonlight. For a moment, she saw not her employer, but a man carrying invisible weight, each line on his face a map of losses unnamed. Then he shifted. The angle changed, and he was again simply Mr. Mercer, the rancher who paid her wages. "Good night," she called softly, not expecting a response. A pause, then night. One word, but it fell into the space between them like a small gift, unexpected and somehow precious. Rebecca smiled in the darkness, an expression so slight it might have been mistaken for a trick of shadow. The house settled into sleep, or something like it, in his room. Boone lay wakeful, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person's breathing, another person's dreams. In the kitchen, Copper's paws twitched as he chased rabbits through fields of sleep, and in her narrow bed, Rebecca pulled her mother's quilt close and whispered a prayer of gratitude for solid walls, honest work, and the possibility, however distant, of peace. High Hollow Ranch stood sentinel against the night, its weathered boards holding new secrets, its rooms learning the rhythm of two hearts beating separately, yet somehow in time. The wind sang through the gaps in the siding, and if the song sounded different than before, fuller, perhaps, or touched with an unfamiliar warmth only the house itself could say for certain. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it the endless round of ranch work, the careful dance of two people learning to share space without sharing themselves. But for now, in the deep quiet of a Colorado night, something as fragile and persistent as hope took root in the dry soil of two guarded hearts. The spring storm rolled in from the west like a dark wall, thunder grumbling across the bare hills. Rebecca had seen it coming all morning, the way the cattle bunched together, the nervous dance of the horses in the corral, the pressure that made her temples ache. She'd managed to get most of the washing done early, but 3 of Boone's work shirts still hung on the line, snapping like trapped birds in the rising wind. The first fat drops hit just as she reached the clothesline. Within seconds, the drops became a torrent. The shirts, heavy with water, fought her efforts to unpeg them. One tore free from her grasp, sailing across the yard like a drunken ghost. She lunged after it, her boots slipping in the sudden mud, her skirts tangling around her legs. The ground disappeared beneath her. She went down hard, mud soaking through her dress, her hands sinking into the red mire. The shirt landed just out of reach, already half buried in a puddle. She struggled to rise, but the wet fabric of her skirts had become a trap, and the rain beat down so hard she could barely see. A hand gripped her elbow firm, steady, pulling her up. Boone! He'd appeared from nowhere. Or perhaps she simply hadn't heard him over the storm's fury. Water streamed from his hat brim, and his face was set in lines of concentration as he helped her find her footing. They didn't speak, couldn't really over the wind's howl. Together they gathered the escaped laundry, Boone's long reach snagging the runaway shirt from its puddle. By the time they stumbled onto the porch, they were both soaked through. Boots squelching, clothes plastered to their skin. Inside, Rebecca stood dripping on the kitchen floor. Suddenly aware of how she must look, hair escaped from its pins, mud streaking her face, her dress clinging in ways that would have horrified her mother. But Boone wasn't looking at her. He'd disappeared into his room, returning with a towel that he handed over without meeting her eyes. "Thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. He nodded, already turning away. Then paused. From somewhere she hadn't even known he possessed such a thing, he produced the ghost of a smile, just a slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. There and gone like lightning. "Looked like you were wrestling that shirt and losing." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving wet boot prints across the floor she'd scrubbed that morning. But somehow, she didn't mind. The next morning, a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine sat outside her door. No note, but she knew. Inside lay a pair of boots, not work boots, but sturdy walking boots of soft brown leather, the kind that would keep her feet dry through wet grass and muddy yards, the kind that cost more than she'd allow herself to spend. She wore them to town the following Saturday, when she drove the wagon in for supplies. At Garland's Mercantile. Mrs. Garland noticed them right away. "Those are fine boots. Rebecca, Mr. Mercer must pay well." "He's a fair employer," Rebecca answered carefully, selecting dried beans from the barrel. Mrs. Garland's eyes narrowed with the pleasure of potential gossip. "Mary Sawyer used to keep house for him. You know, before." Rebecca knew better than to ask, before what? But Mrs. Garland needed no encouragement. Before his wife passed, of course. Little Samuel, too, not even 2 years old. Fever took them both while Boone was driving cattle to Denver. Man hasn't been the same since nearly 5 years now. And he still barely comes to town except when he must. Rebecca kept her hand steady as she measured out cornmeal. But something shifted inside her chest, a loosening, like ice beginning its spring thaw. That evening, she found herself taking extra care with supper. The last of the winter vegetables went into a stew with fresh herbs she'd discovered growing wild by the creek. She baked bread instead of biscuits, the yeasty smell filling the house with warmth. When Boone came in from checking the stock, he stopped in the doorway, inhaling deeply. "Smells like..." He caught himself, jaw tightening. "Like home should smell." Rebecca finished quietly, ladling stew into bowls. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "Yes," he said finally. "Like that." They ate together that night, still in silence, but at the same table. Copper relocated from his spot by the door to the space between their chairs, accepting small offerings from both their plates with dignified gratitude. Over the following weeks, the house began to change in subtle ways. Rebecca repaired the stuck drawer in the kitchen dresser, the one Boone had been fighting with for months. She washed the windows until sunlight poured through like honey, revealing colors in the carpet he'd forgotten existed. The perpetual pile of mending in the basket by his chair steadily diminished, shirts and trousers returning to him with neat patches and reinforced seams. Boone, for his part, began leaving small tokens of appreciation. A handful of early wildflowers in a mason jar by the sink, fresh eggs from a neighbor's chickens when the general store ran out, a new clothesline, strung lower than the old one so she wouldn't have to stretch so far. One evening, as spring softened toward summer, Rebecca sat by the fire reading from her mother's book of poetry. Boone occupied his usual chair, supposedly reviewing the ranch ledgers but actually watching the play of firelight across her face as she read silently. "What's it about?" he asked suddenly, surprising them both. She looked up, marking her place with one finger. "It's Wordsworth. He's writing about daffodils. But really he's writing about memory and loneliness and how beauty can ambush you when you least expect it." "Sounds like a man with too much time for thinking." "Maybe," she conceded. "But sometimes thinking is how we make sense of things that don't make sense any other way." He was quiet for so long she thought the conversation was over. Then, "Read some out loud. I mean, if you don't mind." So she did, her voice soft in the quiet room, reading about a crowd of golden daffodils beside a lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. When she finished, Boone was staring into the fire. "I don't understand half of it," he said, "but it sounds like something Maria would have liked. She was always trying to pretty up the place with flowers and such." It was the first time he'd said his wife's name aloud in Rebecca's presence. She held very still, afraid that any movement might send him retreating back behind his walls. "Tell me about her," she said finally, "if you want to." And to her amazement, he did, haltingly at first, then with growing ease. He painted a picture of a woman who'd loved to sing while she worked, who'd insisted on planting roses by the porch despite everyone telling her they'd never survive the climate, who'd made him laugh with her terrible jokes and her stubborn optimism. "She'd have liked you," he said finally. "You both have that way of making a place feel lived in instead of just occupied." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kind. It's true." He stood abruptly, as if he'd said too much. "Getting late. Morning comes early." But he paused at the doorway. "Maybe you could read more of that poetry sometime, even if I don't understand it all." "I'd like that," Rebecca said softly. After he'd gone, she sat alone by the dying fire, the book open but forgotten in her lap. Outside, an owl called across the darkness, and the wind carried the scent of rain and new growth. The house around her felt different, not just cleaner or more organized, but alive in a way it hadn't been before, as if it were remembering how to breathe. In his room, Boone lay awake thinking about daffodils and dancing and the way Rebecca's voice had made the words sound like music. He thought about Maria, and for the first time in 5 years, the memory brought more sweetness than pain. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of it, like those first green shoots that pushed through winter's last snow. The storm that had brought them together in the mud and rain had passed, but it had left something in its wake. Not love, that was still too large a word, too frightening in its implications, but connection, perhaps recognition, the understanding that two damaged people might build something whole between them, given time and patience and the small daily courage of continuing to try. Tomorrow there would be more work, more silence, more careful navigation of the space they shared. But tonight, as spring rain began to patter gently against the windows, High Hollow Ranch held two people who were learning that loneliness shared might be loneliness halved, and that even the deepest wounds could begin to close if tended with gentle hands. The drawer had been locked for 5 years. Boone stood before the bureau in his bedroom, key trembling slightly in his hand. He'd awakened that morning with Maria's voice in his head, not the fever-weak whisper of her last days, but her laughing tone from before, saying what she'd always said when he was being stubborn. "Boone Mercer, you can't keep the sun from rising by closing your eyes." The key turned with a protest of disuse. Inside, lavender sachets had long since faded to dust, but the ghost of their scent rose up, carrying with it a rush of memory so strong his knees nearly buckled. Maria's letters, tied with blue ribbon. A sketch little Samuel had made wobbly circles he'd called horses. And there, wrapped in tissue paper, the silver hair comb shaped like a columbine flower that he'd given Maria on their wedding day. He lifted it carefully, remembering how it had caught the light in her dark hair as they danced at the church social. She'd worn her mother's dress, taken in and hemmed to fit, and whispered in his ear that she felt like a princess in a fairy story. He'd whispered back that she looked like one too, and she'd laughed, stepping on his toes in her delight. Boone closed his eyes, waiting for the familiar stab of grief. It came, but gentler than before, like an old wound that aches before rain rather than bleeding fresh. Through the kitchen window, he could hear Rebecca humming as she tended the garden plot she'd coaxed back to life. The tune was unfamiliar, something her mother had taught her. Probably. She often hummed while she worked, unconsciously, the way Maria used to sing. Before he could lose his nerve, he carried the comb to the kitchen. Rebecca was just coming in, her apron full of young lettuce and radishes, the first harvest from her efforts. She stopped when she saw what he held, instinctively understanding its significance. "This was Maria's," he said unnecessarily. That is, I'd like you to have it, if you want it." Rebecca set down her apron slowly, vegetables rolling across the table. "Boone, I couldn't, that's too—" "Please." The word came out rougher than intended. It shouldn't stay locked away. Maria wouldn't have wanted that. She believed beautiful things were meant to be used, not hidden. Rebecca took the comb with the reverence due a sacred object, turning it so the silver caught the morning light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." And he was, with a clarity that surprised him. "Wear it on Sunday, maybe to church." If he was asking her to accompany him to church, something he hadn't done since the funeral, neither of them acknowledged it directly. But that Sunday, Rebecca pinned her hair up carefully and nestled the silver comb among the auburn waves. Boone appeared in his good shirt, freshly shaved, hat in hand. "You look—" he started, then cleared his throat. "Maria would be pleased to see it worn again." They sat together in the wagon, not touching but aware of each other in a way that made the air feel charged. At the church, heads turned as Boone Mercer walked through the doors for the first time in 5 years. The mysterious housekeeper beside him wearing Maria Mercer's silver comb. After the service, as people gathered in the churchyard for the monthly dinner, Boone found himself standing slightly apart, old habits dying hard. But Rebecca stayed beside him, her presence a steady anchor. "When Mrs. Garland approached with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. Rebecca met her gaze calmly. "That's a lovely comb," Mrs. Garland observed, her tone suggesting it was anything but lovely to see it in Rebecca's hair. "Yes," Rebecca agreed simply. "It was a gift, Mr. Mercer thought it shouldn't stay hidden away, and I agree. Beautiful things are meant to bring light into the world. Don't you think?" Mrs. Garland retreated, temporarily defeated by Rebecca's serene confidence. But others were kinder. Pastor Ames gripped Boone's hand warmly, saying how good it was to see him. Young Mrs. Patterson admired the vegetable garden Rebecca described, asking for advice about her own failing tomatoes. On the ride home, Boone found himself telling Rebecca about the child's drawing in the bureau, how Samuel had been so proud of his horses, how Maria had insisted on saving every scribble. The words came easier than expected, like water finding its way through a dam's first cracks. He'd have been 7 this year. Boone said quietly. Sometimes I try to picture what he'd look like, whether he'd have had Maria's eyes or mine, her stubborn streak for certain. He did exist, Rebecca said softly. He was loved. That matters, even if the time was short. You sound like you know something about loss. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. My brother died when he was 10. Kicked by a horse. I was 12, old enough to think I should have prevented it somehow. My mother used to say that love doesn't die with a person, it just changes shape, becomes memory, becomes the way we treat others, becomes the gardens we plant and the kindness we show. Your mother sounds wise. She had to be. Life didn't give her much choice. Rebecca touched the comb gently. Thank you for trusting me with this, with all of it. That evening, they worked together to prepare supper, Boone peeling potatoes while Rebecca tended the stove. Their movements had developed a rhythm, a dance of shared space and purpose. When their hands brushed as she reached for a bowl, neither pulled away immediately. I've been thinking, Boone said carefully, about expanding the garden, maybe adding a patch for flowers. Roses, like Maria wanted, and those columbines that grow wild by the creek they might transplant well. I'd like that, Rebecca said, understanding that he was offering more than gardening help. We could start a bed by the porch, where they'd get morning sun. He repeated, testing the word. It felt right in his mouth, like something that had been waiting to be said. That night, after Rebecca had retired, Boone sat in his chair by the fire, but instead of staring into the flames, he sketched. His hands were unpracticed, more used to rope and reins than pencil. But slowly the outline of the ranch house emerged on paper. He added the garden they'd planned, the roses and columbines, and in the doorway, 2 small figures standing together. It wasn't artistic, would never hang in any gallery, but it was a future, tentatively imagined, a possibility sketched in pencil, erasable if need be, but growing more definite with each careful line. In her room, Rebecca unpinned the silver comb and held it up to the lamplight. She thought about the woman who had worn it before, about the strange generosity of being invited to share in someone else's memories. She thought about Boone's face when he'd handed it to her, vulnerable and determined at once, like a man stepping off a cliff and hoping for wings. She set the comb carefully on her small dresser, where it would catch the morning sun. Tomorrow she would wear it again while she and Boone planted the first roses by the porch. Tomorrow they would continue the careful work of building something new from the ashes of what had been lost. It wouldn't be the life either of them had planned, but perhaps her mother's voice whispered in her memory. Perhaps it could be the life they needed. Outside, coyotes sang to the stars, and the wind carried the green scent of growing things. High Hollow Ranch settled into sleep, its walls holding new hope like cupped hands protecting a flame. In the darkness, 2 hearts beat in separate rooms, but to an increasingly synchronized rhythm, learning the melody of, maybe, the harmony of what might yet be. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a rider who didn't wait for a reply. Rebecca found it tucked under the door when she went to sweep the porch, her name written across the front in unfamiliar handwriting. But it was the contents that made her hands shake as she read. Notice of land claim dispute. The property known as High Hollow Ranch, previously deeded to one Matthew Mercer and currently occupied by Boone Mercer, is hereby subject to contested ownership claim by Roland Haynes, pursuant to documentation dated. She read it twice more, her mind catching on details that seemed wrong. The date was smudged, but appeared to predate Matthew Mercer's original claim. The seal looked official at first glance, but something about the wax seemed too fresh, too carelessly applied. And the grammar Rebecca had seen enough legal documents while settling her mother's meager estate to know that lawyers didn't typically make such errors in formal communications. When Boone came in for the noon meal, he found her at the table with the letter spread before her, surrounded by the ranch's old papers she'd retrieved from the desk. What's all this? He picked up the letter, and she watched his face darken as he read. Roland Haynes. Should have known that snake would try something. You know him? My late wife's cousin. Thought he should have gotten part of the ranch when Maria died. Never mind that her father left it clear to me, and it was mine before we married anyway. Boone's jaw tightened. He's been buying up land around here, pushing out smaller ranchers. Guess he figured it was my turn. Rebecca pointed to the date on the supposed claim. Look at this. The ink's different here, darker, and see how the numbers are formed. The rest of the document has flourishes on the sevens, but these are plain. Boone leaned closer, their shoulders touching as they examined the paper. You're right, and this seal Maria kept all our important papers in order. I've seen enough official documents to know this isn't right. We need to take this to a lawyer, Rebecca said. The real kind. Not whoever Roland got to draw this up. Boone looked at her, something warm flickering in his eyes despite the situation. You don't think I'd let you face this alone, do you? She began organizing the papers with brisk efficiency. We'll need the original deed, tax receipts, any correspondence about the property transfer, and we should go today, before Roland has time to file anything officially. They hitched up the wagon and drove to town through the afternoon heat. Charlie Merritt, the town's most respected lawyer, examined their documents with careful attention while Rebecca explained her observations about the forgery. Miss Wynne is quite right, Charlie said finally. This is amateur work. The claim wouldn't hold up in court, but that might not stop Haynes from trying to make trouble. He's been known to use other methods when legal ones fail. Meaning? Boone asked, though his face suggested he already knew. Meaning you should watch your fences, your water rights, your stock. Men like Haynes don't always fight fair. Charlie prepared a formal response to the claim and promised to file it with the circuit judge. In the meantime, document everything, and consider yourself warned. On the ride home, Boone was quiet, his hands tight on the reins. Rebecca could see the weight settling back onto his shoulders, the weight she'd watched him slowly shed over the past months. Thank you, he said finally, for catching what you did, for coming with me. It's my home too, she said softly, then caught herself. Yes, he interrupted. It is. That evening, as they prepared supper together, Boone's hand settled briefly on her shoulder. I've been thinking about what Charlie said. If there's going to be trouble, you should know you don't have to stay. I'd understand if... Rebecca turned to face him, spatula still in hand. Boone Mercer, do you really think I'd run at the first sign of difficulty after everything? I just want you to know you have a choice. I've already made it. She turned back to the stove, but not before he saw the determination in her eyes. Now, are you going to help me with these biscuits or stand there worrying about things that won't happen? Over the following days, they developed new routines. Boone rode the fence lines each morning, checking for cut wire or moved posts. Rebecca kept the important papers in her room and made copies of everything in her careful hand. They began taking turns keeping watch at night, though they didn't speak of it directly. The first real sign of trouble came a week later. 3 head of cattle were found on the wrong side of the south fence, the wire cut clean through. Boone repaired it grimly while Rebecca documented the damage and the distinctive boot prints in the mud nearby. Could be rustlers, Boone said, but they both knew better. Could be, Rebecca agreed. Good thing we're keeping such careful records. That night, she found him cleaning his rifle by lamplight. The sight should have frightened her. She'd seen enough violence in her life to know its cost. Instead, she felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. This man who'd opened his home to her, who'd trusted her with his wife's memory and his own carefully guarded heart, wouldn't face this threat alone. Teach me, she said. He looked up, startled. What? To shoot. If trouble's coming, I should know how to defend what's ours. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Tomorrow, then after chores. The lesson took place behind the barn. Boone patient as he showed her how to hold the rifle, how to sight, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Her first shots went wild, but by the end, she was hitting the target more often than not. "You're a quick study," he said, pride evident in his voice. "I have a good teacher." She handed the rifle back, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "And good motivation." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Boone spoke into the comfortable silence. "My father used to say that a man's true wealth wasn't in what he owned, but in who'd stand beside him when trouble came calling. Your father sounds like a wise man." He'd have liked you." Boone turned to look at her, the fading light softening the lines around his eyes. "Rebecca, But whatever he'd been about to say was cut off by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Tom Garrett, one of the neighboring ranchers, pulled up hard, his horse lathered with sweat. "Boone wanted to warn you saw Roland in town with some rough-looking characters. Heard your name mentioned more than once. Whatever he's planning, looks like it might be soon." After Tom left, they stood together in the gathering darkness. Without thinking, Rebecca reached for Boone's hand, and he gripped it firmly, drawing strength from the contact. "Whatever comes," she said quietly, "we'll face it together." "Together," he agreed, and the word was a promise, a prayer, and a declaration all at once. Inside the house, they moved with purpose, checking windows, barring doors, preparing for a siege they hoped wouldn't come. But beneath the worry ran a deeper current, the knowledge that they were no longer two separate people sharing a space, but something more, something worth fighting for. As the moon rose over High Hollow Ranch, casting silver light across the land they both now called home, Rebecca and Boone prepared to defend not just property and cattle, but the fragile, precious thing growing between them, a second chance neither had expected, but both were determined to protect. Roland Haynes arrived at noon 3 days later, the sun at his back like a spotlight on a stage. He rode a black stallion that pranced and snorted, too much horse for any real working man. 2 companions flanked him, hard-eyed men wearing their guns low and loose, the kind who made their living in shadows and threats. Boone stood on the porch, rifle cradled casual in his arms, but ready. Rebecca waited just inside the door, her own weapon within reach, documents tucked safely in her apron pocket. Copper, sensing tension, growled low and steady from beneath the porch steps. "Boone," Roland called out, his smile slick as oil on water. "Cousin, no need for the artillery. I've come to talk business, all civilized-like. We're not cousins, Roland, and any business between us can be handled through lawyers." Roland's smile widened. "Now, that's no way to treat family. Maria wouldn't have wanted." "Don't," Boone's voice could have cut leather. "Don't you dare speak her name." The hired men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. But Roland raised a hand to still them. "Easy now. I'm just saying we could settle this simple. You've had a good run here, but times are changing. I'm offering to buy you out, fair and square, more than fair even." "The ranch isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price." Roland's eyes drifted to the window where Rebecca's silhouette was visible. "Though I can see why you might be reluctant to leave. Found yourself some comfort. Have you? Can't say I blame you. Woman alone, no family, no prospects, must be grateful for whatever position she can get." Rebecca stepped onto the porch before Boone could respond, her chin high and her voice steady as steel. "Mr. Haynes, I believe you're trespassing. Mr. Mercer has asked you to handle any communication through proper legal channels. As his business manager, I must insist you respect that request." Roland's eyebrows rose. "Business manager, is that what they're calling it these days?" "That's enough." Boone stepped forward, the rifle shifting in his grip. "You've said your piece. Now get off my land." "Our land," Rebecca corrected quietly, and Boone's quick glance held surprise and something deeper. Roland laughed. ugly and sharp. "Oh, this is rich. Well then, I guess I'll have to proceed with filing that claim after all. Judge Harrison's an old friend of mine. We'll see how your little forgery theory holds up when—" When Judge Harrison sees these, Charlie Merritt stepped around the corner of the house, Sheriff Walsh beside him. The lawyer held a leather portfolio, and his expression was grimly satisfied, including the affidavit from Mr. Simmons at the bank, confirming that the seal on your supposed claim was purchased just last month, or perhaps the statement from the clerk who sold you the paper different stock entirely from what was used in the alleged original date. The sheriff moved his coat aside, revealing his badge and gun. "Mr. Haynes, I'll need you to come with me. There are some questions about that document you filed." Roland's face had gone the color of old ash. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove—" "We can and we have," Charlie interrupted. "Miss Wynne here did excellent work documenting the inconsistencies. Any first-year law student could see it's fraudulent. The only question now is whether you'll come quietly or make this worse for yourself." The hired men looked between Roland and the sheriff, calculating odds. Rebecca watched them with steady eyes, her hand resting on her apron where the pistol's weight provided reassurance. "Stand down, boys," Roland said finally, his voice tight with rage. "This isn't over. Mercer, you can't hide behind a woman's skirts and a small-town sheriff forever." "I'm not hiding," Boone said evenly. "Never have been. And if you come at me or mine again, you'll find that out clear enough." As the sheriff led Roland away, his hired men trailing uncertainly, Charlie Merritt climbed the porch steps. That should be the end of it. With the evidence we have, he'll be lucky to avoid prison. At minimum, his reputation's shot. No judge in 3 counties will take him seriously again. "We owe you," Boone said, shaking the lawyer's hand. "You owe Miss Wynne," Charlie corrected. "She's the one who spotted the forgery and built the case. You've got yourself a formidable partner there. Mercer?" After the lawyer left, Boone and Rebecca stood alone on the porch, the tension slowly draining from the air like water from a broken dam. The ranch spread before them, unchanged by the morning's drama, cattle grazing, chickens scratching, the eternal wind bending the grass. "You called it our land," Boone said quietly. Rebecca flushed. "I spoke out of turn. I didn't mean—" "No." He turned to face her fully, setting the rifle aside. "You didn't speak out of turn. You spoke the truth, just maybe before I was ready to say it myself." She met his eyes, seeing in them something that made her heart race. "Boone, these past months, you've made this place alive again. Not just with cooking and cleaning, but with hope. With the idea that maybe life didn't end when Maria and Samuel died, just paused, waiting. You've given me a home," Rebecca said softly. "A real home, not just a position, somewhere I belong." "Then stay." The words came out rough, urgent. "Not as my housekeeper, not as my business manager, as mine. If you'll have me, I know I'm not much for pretty words, and I've got more ghosts than any woman should have to deal with. But—" Rebecca stopped him with a finger to his lips. "I've got ghosts too. Maybe that's why we understand each other. Maybe that's why this works." He caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." The kiss that followed was careful, tentative, 2 people who'd been hurt learning to trust again. But beneath the caution was heat, promise, the potential for something strong and lasting as the land itself. When they pulled apart, both breathless, Boone managed a wry smile. "Roland was wrong about one thing. You're not a woman with no prospects. You're a woman with a ranch, a stubborn rancher, and more cattle than any sensible person would want." Rebecca laughed, the sound bright as morning. "Don't forget the chickens, and Copper, and that vegetable garden that's finally producing." "And the roses," Boone added. "Can't forget Maria's roses." They stood together looking out over High Hollow Ranch, their ranch now. In every way that mattered. The threats might not be entirely over, But they'd weathered the storm. More importantly, they'd done it together, choosing to stand and fight rather than retreat into their separate sorrows. "We should go to town tomorrow," Rebecca said. "Tell Charlie to draw up papers. Make everything official. Business manager to the end," Boone teased, but his eyes were warm. "Someone has to keep you organized." She leaned into his side, feeling the solid strength of him. "Besides, I want everyone to know. No more whispers, no more speculation, just truth." "Just truth," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I like the sound of that." As the sun climbed higher, they turned back to the house together. There was work to be done, there always was on a ranch, but now they would do it as partners in every sense, building a future neither had dared imagine when a lonely rancher first opened his door to a woman seeking a position. The cowboy had wanted quiet nights on the ranch, but what he'd found was so much better a love that didn't erase the past but honored it while reaching for tomorrow. And if the nights were no longer quiet, filled instead with shared laughter and whispered plans and the comfortable sounds of two lives intertwining, well, that was a trade Boone Mercer was more than willing to make. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made the Colorado landscape look like God's own painting. Boone stood before his shaving mirror, hands steadier than they'd been in years as he scraped away the week's stubble. Through the window, he could hear Rebecca humming in her room as she dressed some hymn he half remembered from childhood, the notes carrying on the still air like birds. "Are you sure about this?" he asked his reflection, though the answer was written in every line of his body. He was more sure of this than he'd been of anything since the day he'd asked Maria to marry him in her father's parlor, hands sweating and voice catching on the words. Rebecca emerged from her room wearing the blue dress she'd mended so carefully, the one with tiny flowers embroidered along the collar. The silver columbine comb caught the morning light in her auburn hair, and Boone forgot how to breathe for a moment. "You look—" He cleared his throat. Tried again. "You look beautiful." Color rose in her cheeks, but she met his eyes steadily. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Mr. Mercer." They'd been to church together several times now, but this felt different. This was Boone Mercer returning fully to the community he'd abandoned in his grief, bringing with him the woman who'd helped him find his way back to the living. He knew there would be whispers, speculation, judgment from some quarters. He found he didn't much care. The ride to town was quiet but companionable, their shoulders touching with each sway of the wagon. Rebecca had packed a basket for the church picnic fried chicken, pickled vegetables from her garden, and a dried apple pie that had filled the house with cinnamon sweetness the night before. As they pulled up to the church, Boone saw the familiar clusters of townspeople, the way conversation paused as they passed. But this time, he didn't lower his eyes or hurry past. He helped Rebecca down from the wagon with careful hands, offered her his arm, and walked through the church doors with his head high. Pastor Ames caught his eye from the pulpit, a warm smile creasing his weathered face. The sermon was about rebuilding, about Nehemiah and the walls of Jerusalem, about how God's people worked with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other, building and defending simultaneously. Boone felt Rebecca's hand slip into his during the prayer, her fingers warm and sure. After the service, they spread their blanket under the cottonwoods where families gathered for the monthly picnic. Almost immediately, they had company. Mrs. Patterson approached with her daughter Lucy, a shy girl of about 7 who clutched a handful of wildflowers. "Miss Rebecca?" Lucy whispered, holding out the bouquet. "These are for you. Mama says you're the prettiest lady at church today." "Oh, sweetheart." Rebecca knelt to accept the flowers, her eyes soft. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in ages. Would you like to share our pie? I made plenty." Soon their blanket became a gathering place. Tom Garrett stopped by to thank Boone again for his help with a difficult calving earlier that spring. The blacksmith, Johnson, shared a funny story about a horse that had decided it preferred being a house pet. Even Mrs. Garland that perpetual storm cloud of propriety, paused to compliment Rebecca's chicken. But it was Mrs. Tilly Grant who said what others were thinking. The elderly woman, matriarch of one of the county's oldest families, settled herself on their blanket with surprising agility for her 70-odd years. "I knew Maria," she said without preamble, fixing Boone with sharp eyes. "Sweet girl, terrible loss." She turned to Rebecca. "I also knew your mother, dear, not well, but we crossed paths a few times in Denver before you moved to Los Alamos." Rebecca stiffened slightly. "But, Mrs. Grant patted her hand. "Nothing to fear from me, child. Your mother was a good woman who did her best with what life handed her, just like you're doing." She looked between them, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Maria had spring, you two, your autumn, different season, different beauty. But harvest can be just as sweet as planting time. Sometimes sweeter, because you know the worth of what you're growing." After she tottered off, Boone and Rebecca sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then Rebecca laughed, soft and wondering. "I think we've just been blessed by the local oracle." Felt like it. Boone agreed. He watched her tuck Lucy's wildflowers carefully into her basket, saw how naturally she interacted with the children who kept returning to their blanket for just one more piece of pie. Something loosened in his chest. A knot he hadn't realized was still tied. The afternoon wore on with games for the children, sack races, and egg and spoon contests. Rebecca surprised everyone by hitching up her skirts and joining the women's race, coming in second and laughing so hard she had to sit down to catch her breath. Boone found himself pulled into a horseshoe competition, his years of practice at the ranch serving him well. "Your fellow's quite the shot," one of the women commented to Rebecca as Boone's horseshoe rang against the post. "Yes," Rebecca agreed simply. "He is." The possessive warmth in those two words made Boone miss his next throw entirely. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, families started packing up. Boone and Rebecca worked together to fold their blanket and gather their things, moving with the unconscious coordination of long practice. But as they headed for the wagon, Sheriff Walsh intercepted them. "Mercer, Miss Wynne, wanted to let you know Roland Haynes left town this morning. Seems he decided not to wait for the trial after all. Word is he's headed for California. Figures to start fresh where nobody knows him." "Good riddance," Boone said firmly. "Indeed, though I'd keep an eye out for a bit, just in case. Men like that don't always go quiet." The sheriff tipped his hat. "You folks have a nice evening now." On the ride home, Rebecca was quiet, watching the landscape roll by in the golden evening light. "Finally," she said. "I was afraid, coming today, afraid of what people would say, how they'd look at us." "And now I think maybe I've been afraid of the wrong things." She turned to look at him. "I've spent so much time worrying about being respectable, about what others think, but today I felt like I belonged, not because I was proper or careful, but because I was just myself, with you." Boone pulled the wagon to a stop at the crest of the hill overlooking the ranch. The house sat below them, windows catching the last of the sun, the garden a green patch against the dry earth. Maria's roses were blooming by the porch, a tangle of pink and white that would have made her clap her hands in delight. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "I didn't think I'd say that again to anyone. Didn't think I had it in me. But you've proved me wrong about a lot of things. Rebecca Wynne." She was crying, just a little, tears catching the light like tiny prisms. "I love you too. Have for a while now. I think maybe since that day you helped me up out of the mud." "Romantic beginning," he said dryly, and she laughed through her tears. "The best ones usually are messy," she said. "All the fairy tales get it wrong. Real love isn't about glass slippers and midnight. It's about choosing to stand together when the storms come. It's about building something worth defending." "Speaking of building," Boone said, suddenly nervous again, "I've been thinking, the house has that empty room past the kitchen. Could make a good schoolroom. You mentioned wanting to teach. Boone Mercer, are you proposing to me on a hillside with chickens for witnesses? He looked around, realized that several of their hens had indeed wandered up from the coop and were pecking around the wagon wheels. Well, I suppose I am, though I meant to do it better. Had a whole speech planned. I don't need speeches, Rebecca said softly. I just need you. Is that a yes? That's a yes to everything. To the schoolroom, to the teaching, to taking your name and sharing your life and proving Mrs. Grant right about autumn harvests. He kissed her then. There on the hillside, with the chickens clucking and the sun setting and their whole future spread before them like a promise. When they pulled apart, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. We should get home, Rebecca said. Dawn comes early, and we have a ranch to run. Our ranch, Boone corrected, helping her back onto the wagon seat. Our ranch, she agreed, and the words were better than any vow spoken in church. As they drove down toward High Hollow, toward home, Boone thought about seasons and harvests and second chances. He thought about Maria, hoping she'd understand, knowing somehow that she would. She'd always said life was for living, not for mourning what was lost. And Rebecca was right. Real love was messy and complicated and nothing like the stories. It was built from small moments and daily choices, from shared work and common dreams. It was a woman who noticed forged documents and a man who bought boots without being asked. It was standing together against threats and dancing badly at church picnics and finding joy in ordinary things made extraordinary by sharing them. The cowboy had wanted quiet nights on the ranch, but he'd found something infinitely better. A partner, a future, and a love strong enough to weather any storm the high Colorado plains could throw at them. The sun had set hours ago when Boone should have returned from Barlow's post. Rebecca stood at the window, the untouched supper growing cold on the table. Her grandmother's clock ticking each minute like a stone dropped in still water. He'd left at noon, promising to be back by supper time with supplies and news from town. Copper paced between the door and Rebecca's skirts, whining low in his throat. Even the old dog knew something was wrong. The new moon offered little light, and clouds had rolled in from the mountains, threatening rain that would turn the roads to treacherous mud. Just past midnight, she heard it the scrape of boots on the porch, uneven and dragging. She flew to the door, lamp in hand, to find Boone slumped against the doorframe, his shirt dark with what could only be blood. Horse spooked. He managed through gritted teeth. Canyon Road? Wagon went over. Walked most of the way back. Rebecca's hands were steady despite her racing heart as she helped him inside. Years of tending her mother through illness had taught her to push fear aside when action was needed. She could fall apart later, when the crisis passed. Let me see. She peeled back his torn shirt to reveal a gash along his ribs and bruising that was already purple-black in the lamplight. His left ankle was swollen nearly double, and his hands were scraped raw from climbing back up the rocky slope. Lucky, he muttered. Could have been worse. Would have been, if I hadn't grabbed that juniper. Hush now. Save your strength. Rebecca gathered what she needed: the whiskey for cleaning wounds, torn sheets for bandages, willow bark tea for the pain. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, calm and instructive. Clean hands, clean water, gentle pressure. The body wants to heal itself. We just help it along. She worked through the night, cleaning and binding his wounds, splinting the ankle that was thankfully sprained rather than broken. Boone drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering apologies for the trouble, for scaring her, for the supplies lost with the wagon. None of that matters, Rebecca told him firmly, spooning willow bark tea between his cracked lips. You're here. You're alive. Everything else can be replaced. When dawn finally came, pale and uncertain through the windows, Boone was sleeping more peacefully. His fever had broken, and his breathing was steady. Rebecca allowed herself a moment to simply sit beside him, her hand resting lightly on his chest to feel the reassuring rise and fall. She thought of all the ways this could have ended differently. If the wagon had rolled one more time, if he hadn't been strong enough to walk home, if she hadn't been here to tend him. The thought of returning to a life without him, of this house empty again of his quiet presence, made her stomach clench with a fear sharper than any she'd felt during the long night. "Not going anywhere," Boone mumbled, his eyes still closed, but his hand finding hers. "Too stubborn to die on you now." "You better not," she said, trying for stern but achieving something closer to desperate. "I've gotten used to having you around." He cracked one eye open, managing a ghost of his rare smile despite the pain. "Just used to me. Maybe a little more than that." "Good, because I walked 6 miles on a busted ankle thinking about you, about how I needed to get home to you." His fingers tightened around hers. "Kept me going when I wanted to just lie down in the dirt and quit." Rebecca blinked back tears. "No quitting allowed. House rule." "Yes, ma'am." The next days blurred together in a routine of care. Rebecca took on the ranch work without complaint, learning quickly that the cattle didn't much care if she knew what she was doing as long as she showed up with hay. She mended fence where she could reach, hauled water, collected eggs, all while checking on Boone every hour. Tom Garrett rode over when he noticed the high hollow cattle straying toward his land, found Rebecca trying to herd them back with more determination than skill. "Where's Boone?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Healing," she said simply. "Wagon accident on the canyon road." Tom dismounted without another word, helped her drive the cattle home, then stayed to handle the heavier chores. Word spread as it always did in small communities, and soon Rebecca had more help than she knew what to do with. Johnson from the smithy repaired the broken gate. Mrs. Patterson sent her eldest boy over to help with the evening milking. Even Mrs. Garland arrived with a pot of soup and a grudging offer to sit with Boone while Rebecca caught up on sleep. "Don't look so surprised," the older woman huffed. "I've got my opinions, but I'm not heartless. Besides, anyone can see you're dead on your feet." It was true. Rebecca had been running on determination and coffee for 3 days straight. She accepted the help gratefully, falling into her own bed for a few precious hours while Mrs. Garland read to Boone from the newspaper in her unexpectedly melodious voice. On the 4th day, Boone insisted on getting up, hobbling to the porch with a crutch Tom had fashioned from a sturdy branch. Rebecca fussed and worried, but he was adamant. "Man can't run a ranch from his bed," he groused, though his face was still pale and moving clearly cost him. "Man can't run a ranch if he re-injures himself either," Rebecca countered. But she helped him settle into the rocking chair, tucking a blanket around his legs despite the warm afternoon. They sat together watching the ranch come back to life under their neighbor's care. It was humbling, Boone admitted, to need help this way. He'd prided himself on self-sufficiency for so long that accepting assistance felt like admitting weakness. "It's not weakness," Rebecca said softly. "It's community. It's what people do for each other, what you've done for others plenty of times." "When did you get so wise?" "Somewhere between mucking out stalls and learning that chickens are mean when you take their eggs." She showed him the pecking marks on her hands, making him laugh despite his sore ribs. As Boone healed, they talked about things they'd danced around before, about the future, about children, about the schoolroom Rebecca wanted to start, about his first marriage, her childhood, the paths that had led them to each other. "I never expected this," Boone said one evening as they watched thunderheads build over the mountains. "After Maria died, I thought that was my one chance. Figured I'd just work the ranch until I couldn't anymore. Then nothing. Life has a way of surprising us," Rebecca said. "Good and bad both. The trick is being open to the good when it comes along, even if you've been hurt by the bad." "Especially then," Boone agreed, reaching for her hand. "Fear makes you think small, makes you pull back from what could have sent you away that first day. Kept my walls up, stayed safe and alone. I'm glad you didn't. So am I. Every day, I'm glad. By the second week, Boone was moving more easily. The ankle almost normal size again and the ribs healing clean. Rebecca had proven herself capable of more than either of them had imagined, handling not just the house, but the ranch work with increasing confidence. The experience had changed something between them, deepened it. They'd weathered another crisis together, and their bond was stronger for it. On the evening, Boone finally managed to walk to the barn and back without the crutch. He found Rebecca in the kitchen preparing supper, humming that hymn he loved. He watched her for a moment, this woman who'd saved him in more ways than she probably knew. "Marry me," he said, the words coming out more abrupt than planned. "Soon as I can stand steady in front of the preacher. I know we talked about it before, but I mean it now more than ever. These past 2 weeks showed me clear I don't want to face anything else life throws at us unless you're by my side, legal and proper and permanent." Rebecca turned from the stove, her face luminous in the lamplight. "Boone Mercer, you're supposed to be resting." "Woman, that's not an answer." She crossed to him, framed his face with flour-dusted hands. "Yeah, of course, yes, soon as you can stand steady, or sitting down if need be. I'm not particular about the details, just the outcome." He kissed her then, tasting joy and promise and the salt of happy tears. Outside, the threatened rain finally began to fall, gentle and steady, blessing the thirsty earth. The sound wrapped around them like a benediction, nature's own approval of love that had grown slowly but surely, rooted deep as the ranch itself in the Colorado soil. "No more midnight walks from town," Rebecca said when they pulled apart. "New house rule." "Yes, ma'am," Boone agreed, gathering her close. "Though if that's what it took to get us here, I'd do it again." "Don't you dare," she said, but she was smiling. And he was home, and the ranch was whole, and tomorrow they'd start making wedding plans. The cowboy who'd wanted quiet nights had found something worth all the noise and chaos in the world, a partner to share both the burdens and the blessings. In sickness and health, in wagon accidents and ordinary afternoons. From this day forward, the drought came like a thief, stealing moisture from the air and life from the land. By late July, the grass had turned brittle as old paper, crumbling under the cattle's hooves. The creek that gave Dry Creek Ridge its name lived up to its promise, dwindling to a trickle that couldn't support the herd. Every morning, Boone and Rebecca watched the cloudless sky with growing dread. Then came the first sign of human trouble, fresh cuts in the fence wire, too clean to be accidental. 3 head of cattle missing, including the pregnant heifer Boone had been watching carefully. Boot prints in the dust led toward the canyon, but the trail went cold on the rocky ground. "Could be drifters," Tom Garrett said when he rode over to share what he'd heard in town. "But there's talk that some of Roland's old associates are still around, men who might figure you're vulnerable now, what with the drought and all." That night, Rebecca noticed the glow first, an orange flicker on the horizon where no light should be. She shook Boone awake, and they stood at the window watching the fire crawl across the distant pasture like a living thing. "The hay barn," Boone said, already pulling on his boots. "If that catches." They ran together, Rebecca carrying buckets while Boone pumped water furiously from the well. The flames had already claimed the pile of winter feed they'd stacked outside, and sparks were dancing toward the barn roof. The cattle, penned nearby, bellowed in fear, pressing against the far fence. "Let them out!" Boone shouted over the roar of flames. "Drive them to the east pasture!" Rebecca fumbled with the gate latch, her hands shaking. The metal was hot from the nearby fire, and the cattle were half mad with panic. As the gate swung open, they surged forward, nearly knocking her down. She grabbed a fence post, holding on as the herd thundered past. Through the smoke and chaos, she glimpsed a figure on horseback silhouetted against the flames, watching, waiting. When she blinked to clear her stinging eyes, the rider was gone. Boone had managed to soak the barn wall with what little water they had, creating a firebreak of wet wood. They beat at the creeping flames with wet burlap sacks, their arms aching, lungs burning from smoke, just when it seemed the barn would catch despite their efforts. Tom Garrett arrived with his sons, bringing more hands and fresh water barrels. They fought the fire until dawn, when it finally died to smoldering ash and blackened earth. The winter hay was gone, but the barn stood. Most of the cattle had been saved, though they'd be counting for days to know the full loss. As the sun rose over the devastation, Sheriff Walsh arrived with troubling news. Found kerosene tins hidden in the rocks. This was no accident. And Boone, we picked up Jake Morrison trying to sell cattle with altered brands 2 towns over. Brands that looked mighty like yours underneath. Morrison had been one of Roland's hired men, the quiet one who'd kept his hand near his gun that day on the porch, under questioning. He'd admitted to the rustling, but swore he knew nothing about the fire. Still, it painted a clear picture someone was trying to finish what Roland had started. That evening, exhausted and heartsick, Boone and Rebecca sat on the porch steps surveying the damage. Without winter hay and with half their water gone to fighting the fire, keeping the herd alive through the drought would be near impossible. We could sell some cattle, Rebecca said quietly. Enough to buy feed. At drought prices, we'd be lucky to get half what they're worth. Might as well be giving them away. Boone rubbed his face, leaving streaks of soot. Whoever's behind this, they're smart. Attack the resources, not the people. Make it look like bad luck instead of malice. Then we'd be smarter. Rebecca's voice hardened with determination. We know they're watching. Let them see what they expect us struggling, getting desperate. Meanwhile, we set our own trap. Over the next week, they played their parts. Rebecca made trips to town, visiting the bank, looking worried. Boone was overheard at the saloon talking about maybe selling out after all. They moved the remaining cattle to the most visible pasture, making the herd look smaller than it was. But at night, they prepared. Tom Garrett and several other neighbors quietly pledged support men who'd had their own run-ins with Roland's type and weren't about to see good people driven off their land. They took turns watching from hidden posts, waiting. The attack came on a moonless night. Rebecca woke to Copper's low growl, then the distinctive sound of cattle being moved. She touched Boone's shoulder. He was already awake, already reaching for his rifle. This time, they were ready. The would-be rustlers had cut the fence and were driving cattle toward the canyon, the same route Morrison had used. But as they entered the narrow passage, lanterns blazed to life on both sides. Tom Garrett's voice rang out. Drop your weapons, you're surrounded. For a moment, violence trembled in the air. Then more lanterns appeared. Johnson the blacksmith, the Patterson boys, even Pastor Ames holding a shotgun with surprising authority. The rustlers were outnumbered 3-1. Well, well, Boone said, stepping into the light. Charlie Briggs should have known Roland would leave his foreman to clean up his mess. Briggs spat tobacco juice, his scarred face twisting. Haynes promised me a cut of this land. I mean to collect. Only thing you'll be collecting is jail time, Sheriff Walsh said, emerging from the shadows with his deputies. We've got you cold rustling, arson, destruction of property. Judge is going to have a field day. As the sheriff's men rounded up the rustlers, Rebecca noticed one trying to slip away in the confusion. Without thinking, she raised the pistol Boone had taught her to use and fired a warning shot that kicked up dust at the man's feet. I wouldn't, she said calmly. I've been practicing. The man froze, hands rising slowly. Tom Garrett whistled appreciatively. Remind me not to cross Mrs. Mercer. Future Mrs. Mercer, Boone corrected, pride evident in his voice. But the point stands. With Briggs and his men arrested, the immediate threat was over. But the damage remained: lost cattle, destroyed feed, the ongoing drought. As dawn broke, the neighbors who'd stood guard gathered in the ranch house kitchen, where Rebecca somehow produced coffee and biscuits for everyone. We can't thank you enough, she said, refilling cups with hands that barely trembled. "No thanks needed," Johnson said firmly. "This is what we do, what community means. Today it was your ranch. Tomorrow it might be mine. We stand together or we fall separately." Over the next days, that community support proved itself in tangible ways. Neighbors contributed what hay they could spare. The church took up a collection to help replace the burned feed. Mrs. Grant, that surprising ally, organized the women to provide meals so Rebecca and Boone could focus on rebuilding. The drought would continue for another month before the rains finally came, but they would survive it. The rustlers' trial was swift, with sentences that would keep them away for years. Word spread that High Hollow Ranch was protected, that anyone who came against it would face not just Boone Mercer, but the entire valley. One evening, as purple thunderheads finally gathered on the horizon, promising rain, Boone found Rebecca in the garden, staking up the tomato plants that had somehow survived on dishwater and determination. "You know what you said that night about us being partners?" He knelt beside her, helping support a drooping vine. "I understand it now. Truly, it's not just about sharing the good times. It's about facing the fires together, literal and otherwise. And having people who'll stand with you when trouble comes." Rebecca added, "I never had that before. Never thought I deserved it." "You deserve all of it," Boone said firmly. "The help, the respect, the place here. We both do." The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and promising. They didn't run for shelter, instead standing together in the garden as the drought broke at last. The rain came harder, soaking their clothes, running in rivulets through the thirsty earth. Rebecca laughed, throwing her head back to catch the drops, and Boone pulled her close, kissing her in the downpour. "The cowboy wanted quiet nights on the ranch," he murmured against her lips, repeating the thought that had haunted him for months. "But you turned them into temptation." "Good temptation or bad," she teased. "The best kind, the kind that saves a man's life and gives him reason to fight for it." Thunder rolled across the valley, and lightning illuminated the ranch, scarred but standing, tested but unbroken, like them, like their love. The fire had tried to consume what they'd built, but instead had only proved how strong their foundations were, how deep their roots had grown in this unforgiving soil. Tomorrow there would be damage to repair, fences to mend, the slow work of rebuilding. But tonight, as the rain washed the ash from the land and filled the empty creek beds, Boone and Rebecca stood in their garden and let the storm baptize their survival, their partnership, their unshakable faith that together they could weather whatever came. The rains that broke the drought had blessed the land, and by early September, High Hollow Ranch showed signs of recovery. New grass pushed through the blackened earth where fire had scarred it, and the creek ran full again, its voice a constant murmur of renewal. The physical wounds were healing, fences mended, barn repaired, the herd slowly rebuilding. But other kinds of healing took longer, required different medicine. Boone found himself standing more often at the small cemetery plot on the hill, where Maria and Samuel lay beneath simple stones. The guilt that had kept him away for so long had gentled into something else, a quiet sorrow that no longer consumed but simply existed, like a scar that ached before storms. "I'm getting married again," he said to the graves one evening, hat in his hands. "Her name's Rebecca. You'd like her. Maria. She's got your way of making a house feel alive. And she's teaching me things like how loving again doesn't mean loving you less." The wind through the pines might have been an answer, or just the wind, but Boone felt lighter walking back down the hill, as if confession had lifted something from his shoulders. Rebecca had her own reconciliations to make. A letter had arrived from Denver, unexpected after years of silence. Her cousin Martha, writing to say she'd heard Rebecca was well situated, asking after her welfare, the same cousin who'd turned her away after their mother's death, claiming no room, no resources for charity. "Will you write back?" Boone asked, watching Rebecca read the letter for the third time. "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell her exactly what those years were like, being turned away by family. But another part, she folded the letter carefully. Another part thinks maybe forgiveness is lighter to carry than anger. She did write back, eventually. A brief, polite response that opened no doors but didn't close them either. It was enough, she decided. The past had shaped her but didn't own her anymore. As September wore on, the house filled with preparations for the wedding. Nothing fancy, neither of them wanted that, but Rebecca insisted on certain touches. New curtains for the windows, wildflowers in mason jars, the good china brought down from the attic and washed until it gleamed. The dress came together slowly, pieced from good fabric misses. Patterson had been saving and sewn during evening hours by lamplight. Rebecca had learned from her mother, and her fingers remembered the stitches even when her eyes grew tired. Boone would sit nearby, pretending to read but really watching her work, the domestic intimacy of it filling something in him that had been empty too long. "Tell me about the flowers," Rebecca said one evening, working on the hem. "The columbines. Why did Maria love them so?" Boone set aside his book. They grew wild where she was raised, up in the mountains. Her grandmother told her they looked like doves. That's what columbine means. She said, doves gathering for peace. Maria planted them everywhere we lived, trying to make home feel like those mountains. "And now they grow here," Rebecca said softly. She succeeded. More than she knew. Boone moved to sit beside her on the floor, taking her free hand. "Rebecca, I need you to understand something. When we stand up there and make those vows, I'll mean every word, but I won't pretend the past didn't happen. Maria, Samuel, they're part of who I am." "I wouldn't want you to pretend." Rebecca set aside her sewing to face him fully. "That grief shaped you into the man I love. Someone who knows how precious life is because he's lost it. Someone who chooses to try again despite the risk. That takes a courage I didn't understand until I met you." They talked late into the night about the ghosts they each carried, the fears that whispered in quiet moments. Rebecca spoke of nights spent hungry, of employers who'd treated her as less than human, of the constant fear that one misstep would leave her destitute again. Boone talked about the guilt of being away when Maria died, the what-ifs that had tortured him, the way Samuel's laugh still echoed in dreams. "We're both carrying more than our share," Rebecca said finally. "Maybe that's why we fit. We know how to help bear the load." The next morning brought an unexpected test of that statement. During his rounds, Boone discovered a young boy hiding in the barn, maybe 8 years old, rail thin, with the hollow look of someone who'd been hungry too long. "Please, mister," the boy begged when cornered. "I didn't take nothing. Just needed somewhere dry to sleep." Something in those desperate eyes hit Boone like a physical blow. Samuel would have been near this age. He found himself kneeling, making himself smaller, less threatening. "What's your name, son?" "William, Billy." The boy's voice shook. "My folks died of fever last month. Neighbor said he'd take me to the orphanage, but I ran. Heard they beat you there, make you work like a slave." Boone thought of Rebecca's stories about her own youth, the cold charity that came with conditions and contempt. "You hungry, Billy?" The boy's nod was answer enough. In the kitchen, Rebecca took one look at the child and went into motion. Soon, Billy was seated at their table, wolfing down eggs and biscuits like he might never see food again. She didn't pepper him with questions, just kept his plate and cup full, occasionally brushing the hair from his eyes with gentle fingers. "He can't go to the orphanage," Boone said quietly while Billy dozed by the fire later, exhausted and finally warm. "No," Rebecca agreed. "He can't." They looked at each other, a whole conversation in that glance. The spare room, the schoolhouse Rebecca wanted to start, the empty place at their table that might be filled by a boy who needed what they could give. "It won't be easy," Rebecca warned. Traumatized children need patience, consistency, and the law might have something to say about it. "Then we'll do it legal. Charlie Merritt can help with papers." Boone watched the boy sleep. seeing not a replacement for what he'd lost, but a new chance to give what he'd learned. If you're willing. I'm willing. Billy woke to find them sitting nearby, clearly waiting. The wariness returned to his eyes, the expectation of rejection. Rebecca spoke first, her voice gentle but direct. Billy, how would you feel about staying here not as charity, but as family? You'd have chores, expectations, schooling, but you'd also have a home, for as long as you want it. The boy's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You mean it, both of you? We mean it. Boone confirmed. Won't lie and say it'll be perfect. We're still figuring things out ourselves. But if you're willing to try, so are we. Billy's tears came then, the desperate sobs of a child who'd held everything in too long. Rebecca gathered him close, rocking slightly, while Boone laid a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. They stayed that way until the storm passed, until Billy could breathe again. Yes, he whispered. Yes, please. Over the following days, they adjusted to being 3 instead of 2. Billy was skittish as a wild colt, expecting rejection, testing boundaries, but slowly, carefully. Trust began to build. He helped Rebecca in the garden, learning the names of vegetables. He followed Boone around the ranch, soaking up lessons about cattle and horses and the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. The wedding was set for the following Sunday, when Rebecca suggested postponing it, wanting Billy to feel secure first. The boy surprised them both. Don't wait on account of me, he said, small face serious. I'd like to see you get married. Never been to a wedding before. So the plans continued. With one addition, Billy would stand up with Boone, holding the rings, Mrs. Patterson altered one of her son's outgrown suits to fit him. For the first time since arriving, Billy smiled, running his hands over the fabric. Never had something so fine, he said wonderingly. You clean up good, Boone told him, adjusting the boy's collar. Just like I did when I married the first time, nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. You were married before? Billy asked, then caught himself. Sorry, didn't mean to. It's all right. Boone sat on the bed, patting the spot beside him. Billy perched carefully, still ready to run. Her name was Maria. We had a son, Samuel. They died of fever, like your folks. That why you took me in 'cause of him? Boone considered the question, owing the boy honesty. Maybe that's part of it, but mostly we took you in because you needed us. And we needed you. Not to replace anybody or your own person, Billy, but because families can grow in all sorts of ways. Miss Rebecca lost people too. She did. That's how we learned to help each other. And now we'll help you, if you'll let us. Billy leaned slightly into Boone's side, the first voluntary contact he'd initiated. I'll let you. That evening, as Rebecca tucked Billy into the bed they'd made up in the spare room, soon to be his room, he caught her hand. Are you happy I'm here? He asked. Truth. Rebecca smoothed his hair, feeling the trust in that simple question. The truth is, you've made our family complete in a way we didn't even know it needed. So yes, Billy, I'm happier than I know how to say. As she and Boone prepared for bed, the house settling around them with its new configuration of souls, Rebecca reflected on how healing happened, not in grand gestures, but in small acceptances, in choosing to trust again after betrayal, to love again after loss, to open doors that fear wanted to keep closed. The cowboy wanted quiet nights on the ranch. Boone murmured, pulling her close in the darkness. But she turned them into temptation, Rebecca finished, understanding finally what kind of temptation he meant. The temptation to live fully again, to risk the heart, to build something worth losing because the having was worth the risk. Tomorrow they would marry, with their new son beside them and their community around them. The ghosts would be there too. Maria and Samuel, Rebecca's mother. Billy's parents not as shadows, but as part of the foundation of what they were building. Love upon love. Loss transformed to wisdom. 3 broken people choosing to become whole together. The ranch slept peacefully, cradled in starlight and promise. In the spare room, a boy dreamed without fear for the first time in weeks, and in their bed. 2 people who'd thought themselves finished with romance whispered plans for a future neither had dared imagine, tempted by hope into believing they deserved every bit of happiness they could build together. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, as if the Colorado sky itself had dressed for the occasion. Behind the ranch house, beneath the great cottonwood that had sheltered the land for longer than anyone could remember, chairs borrowed from the church stood in neat rows. Billy had been up since dawn, meticulously arranging wildflowers in mason jars under Rebecca's gentle direction. "Do the columbines go in the middle?" he asked, holding up the delicate purple blooms. "Wherever you think looks best." Rebecca told him, adjusting the silver comb in her hair, Maria's comb, now hers, a bridge between past and future. "You're doing a wonderful job." The boy beamed, still unused to praise but learning to accept it. He'd filled out some in just the 2 weeks since they'd taken him in, the hollow look leaving his cheeks. More importantly, the wariness in his eyes had begun to fade, replaced by tentative trust. Boone stood before the small mirror in his room, fumbling with his collar. His hands, so steady with rope and reins, seemed clumsy with the unfamiliar buttons. A knock at the door interrupted his struggle. "Need help?" Tom Garrett peered in, already dressed in his Sunday best. "Feels like I'm trying to saddle a snake," Boone admitted, letting his friend take over the buttons. "Was easier the first time. Course I was younger then. Thought I knew everything. And now I know enough to know I don't know much, but I know this is right." Boone glanced out the window to where Rebecca was showing Billy how to pin a boutonniere. "Never thought I'd stand up there again, Tom. Never thought I'd want to." "Life has a way of surprising us," Tom said, finishing with the collar. "There, you look almost respectable." The guests began arriving by mid-morning, ranchers and townspeople, faces weathered by sun and wind, but softened now by the occasion. Mrs. Grant held court near the punch bowl, regaling anyone who'd listen with predictions about the weather and the couple's future happiness. Pastor Ames reviewed his notes one more time, smiling at the simplicity of what the couple had requested. Charlie Merritt brought the adoption papers he'd drawn up, ready for signing after the ceremony. Making Billy officially theirs had been Boone and Rebecca's first united decision, and the boy didn't know yet it would be their wedding gift to him. As the sun climbed toward noon, Boone took his place beneath the cottonwood, Billy beside him, clutching the ring box like it contained diamonds instead of simple silver bands. The guests settled, conversations dying to expectant whispers. Then Rebecca appeared at the back door, and Boone forgot how to breathe. She wore the dress she'd sewn with such care, ivory cotton that caught the light like morning mist. The columbine comb sparkled in her auburn hair, which she'd left partly down in soft waves. But it was her smile that stopped his heart radiant. Certain, aimed at him like he was the only person in the world. Mrs. Patterson's daughter Lucy scattered rose petals as Rebecca walked the makeshift aisle. No father to give her away. But Rebecca had said she preferred it that way she was giving herself, freely and fully, to the life she'd chosen. When she reached him, Boone took her hands, feeling the calluses that matched his own. Working hands, healing hands, hands that had learned to be gentle after knowing too much hardship. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Ames began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We come together today to witness something precious, not just the joining of 2 lives, but the continued healing of hearts that have known loss, the building of a family from the ashes of sorrow, and the triumph of hope over fear." The ceremony was simple, as they'd requested. No flowery speeches or elaborate rituals, just 2 people promising to stand together through whatever came, to build something lasting on the foundation of friendship and respect that had grown into love. When it came time for the rings, Billy stepped forward so seriously that a ripple of fond laughter went through the crowd. His hands shook slightly as he opened the box, but his smile when Boone ruffled his hair was bright as sunshine. "Rebecca," Boone said, slipping the ring onto her finger. "You came into my life when I'd forgotten how to live it. You reminded me that closing yourself off from pain also closes you off from joy. You've made this ranch a home again, made me whole again. I promise to stand beside you through drought and plenty, through quiet times and storms, for all the days we're given." Rebecca's eyes shimmered with tears, but her voice was steady. "Boone, you offered me shelter when I needed it, but you gave me so much more. You gave me respect, partnership, and the chance to belong somewhere fully. You showed me that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about choosing who to stand with. I promise to be your partner in all things, to help carry whatever burdens come, and to celebrate every blessing we find. By the power vested in me," Pastor Ames said, beaming, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Boone, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was sweet and sure, a seal on promises made. While the crowd erupted in cheers, Billy clapped loudest of all, bouncing on his toes with excitement. But Boone raised a hand for quiet. "Before we celebrate, Rebecca and I have something else to do." He nodded to Charlie Merritt, who brought forward the papers. "Billy, come here, son." The boy approached uncertainly, glancing between them. "These are adoption papers," Rebecca explained gently. "If you're willing, we'd like to make official what's already true in our hearts. You're our son, Billy, not replacing anyone, not filling someone else's spot. Our son." Billy's mouth opened, but no words came. Instead, he launched himself at them, thin arms wrapping around both their waists, tears soaking into Rebecca's wedding dress. The crowd blurred through Boone's own tears as he held his family whole, imperfect, beautiful. They signed the papers right there, with half the county as witnesses. Billy signed too, his letters careful and proud. Then the celebration began in earnest, tables groaning with food the neighbors had brought. Fiddle music courtesy of Johnson's nephew, dancing that lasted until the stars came out. As the evening wound down, Boone found himself standing apart for a moment, watching Rebecca teach Billy a simple dance while neighbors clapped along. The sight filled him with a contentment he'd thought lost forever. "She's good for you," a voice said beside him. "Mrs." Grant had approached on silent feet, her usual sharp expression softened. "Both of them are. And you're good for them. That's how it works, you know. We save each other." "Yes," Boone agreed simply. "We do." Later, after the guests had gone and Billy had fallen asleep in his new bed, worn out from excitement, Boone and Rebecca sat on their porch in the quiet night. The ranch spread before them, the same land but transformed somehow by the day's promises. "Any regrets?" Rebecca asked, leaning into his shoulder. "Only that it took so long to find you." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You." "Not a one." She was quiet for a moment, then laughed softly. The cowboy wanted quiet nights on the ranch, but she turned them into temptation. Boone finished. The best kind. The kind that makes a man grateful for noise and chaos and all the beautiful complications of a full life. 2 beautiful complications, Rebecca agreed, raising an imaginary glass. 2 second chances. Boone added, "To family," they said together, the word encompassing all of it, the boy sleeping safely inside. The memories that blessed rather than haunted, the community that had stood with them, the love that had grown slowly but surely in the harsh soil of the Colorado plains. The wind carried the scent of Rebecca's roses, blooming now alongside Maria's columbines. Different seasons, different loves, but all part of the same garden. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, Billy's first day of school in Rebecca's new classroom, the constant work of the ranch, the ordinary struggles of 3 people learning to be a family. But tonight, sitting beneath stars that had witnessed so much sorrow and now bore witness to joy. Boone and Rebecca Mercer held hands and dreamed of all the seasons to come. The drought would return someday. Troubles would find them. Loss would visit again as it visits all who dare to love. But they would face it together, with open hearts and helping hands, knowing that some temptations, like the temptation to live fully, love deeply, and hope always, were worth every risk. High Hollow Ranch settled into sleep, its rooms filled with the breathing of family, its walls strong with the knowledge that broken things could be mended, empty places could be filled, and even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience, courage, and love. The story of the cowboy who wanted quiet nights had become something richer, a tale of how life's greatest blessings often come disguised as complications, and how the very things we think we want might pale beside what we truly need. In the end, Boone had found his peace not in solitude but in connection, not in silence but in the sweet chaos of hearts joined together, building something beautiful from the ashes of what was lost. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this journey through the wild and beautiful landscape of the American West. I hope this tale of love, loss, and redemption has touched your hearts as much as it touched mine in the telling. Where are you listening to this story? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know if you're in a bustling city dreaming of wide-open spaces, or perhaps in your own rural corner of the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, romance, and the indomitable human spirit that tamed the frontier. And please, share your thoughts about Boone and Rebecca's story. Which moment moved you most? Your comments mean the world to me and help shape the stories yet to come. Until we meet again on the dusty trails of imagination, keep your hearts open to love's beautiful complications.